All right. Well, my name is Brandon McBain. I'm the Director of Membership Services and Programs for the National Wheelchair Basketball Association, and I have the pleasure tonight to be the moderator for tonight's webinar entitled NWBA Gender Eligibility Policy, Creating a Safe and Fair Environment for All to Learn, Play, and Compete. Our webinar series is presented by ABC Medical. ABC Medical has been a long-time partner of the NWBA and the webinar series, and we want to thank them for their support and their continued support of the NWBA and their members and their comprehensive medical supply products. So thank you, ABC Medical, for your support of the NWBA. So a couple of housekeeping, which with our attendees, we'll ask throughout tonight that you just drop your questions into the chat and or hold them until the end. We have a variety of topics that we're going to be covering, and we want to make sure that we cover off on those, and we might be covering those questions you have later in the presentation. So by all means, you can drop them into the chat, but we just might address them later in the discussion. And aside from that, now I have the pleasure of introducing our two presenters for this evening. First, we have Doug Jones. Doug's been involved in wheelchair basketball since 1982. Started his playing days for the North Florida Renegades and played 12 seasons there, and then moved over playing for the Fresno Red Rollers in '95, but then his last playing career was with the Dallas Wheelchair Mavericks, where Doug went on to win 6 national championships. Doug also had success coaching, winning another 4 national championships. He's also a member and a player of 2 World Cup teams, and he has held a variety of different administrative roles in wheelchair basketball, starting in 1996, and Doug most recent honor was being inducted into the NWBA Hall of Fame in 2017. Doug's continued his work off the court, serving as the president of the Intercollegiate Division, and currently serving on the board of directors, the chair of ethics, and the chair of the governance committees. So thanks, Doug, for presenting. And next up, and next presenter we have tonight is Chance Cochran. Chance is an attorney and civil rights advocate. Chance is also a former Team USA athlete, and Chance currently is involved with a group that you're going to learn more tonight on, that the NWBA partnership with is Inclusive Playbook. He's also spent time campaigning at the Legal Center and Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown University Law Center. And he's an expert on inclusive policies and transgender participation in sports. And he's continued to be committed to help with involvement in the LGBTQ and causes that range from on the ground protests to authorizing a variety of brief gender identity, gender expression submissions to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So Chance brings a wealth of knowledge firsthand as an athlete, but then as an expert in this space. So we look forward to having both Chance and Doug present on the topic tonight. So our session objectives for this evening, as we hope from this webinar, It creates an opportunities to individuals to be more educated on the space of transgender athletes, clarity on what the landscape and the participation of transgender athletes in just sport, and then what the NWBA's Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity Action Plan included for prioritization of inclusion of transgender athletes for participation, and then walking you through the development and the implementation of the gender eligibility policy the NWBA has developed. And lastly, the importance of gender eligibility requirements and actions that allow one individual to participate and be in good standing with the NWBA for their teams and when they're competing at sanctioned competitions. So with all of that, I am going to pass the baton over to you, Chance.
Great. Thank you so much for that intro, Brandon. And thanks for everyone who's watching. Just to rehash, just like Brandon was saying, I'm Chance. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I run the sports inclusion program at Inclusion Playbook. Over the course of my career in sports, I've both coached and played with trans athletes. So this is kind of an area that I've thought about from a lot of different angles, and it's something that I care really deeply about. Today, I'm just going to give sort of a brief overview of some key terms in the current landscape of trans inclusion in sports, which will hopefully contextualize what Brandon and Doug are going to speak about later. The kinds of policies that we're talking about, it's worth mentioning, often directly impact non-trans athletes as well, right? Especially like non-binary or genderqueer folks. But I'm still probably going to use the term trans inclusion just as a shorthand. It's just something to keep in mind. So first off, I just want to lay out a few terms that are kind of key to understanding this discussion. They're listed here. The first one is gender identity. And a person's gender identity is their internal and psychological sense of self as a man, a woman, both, in between, or neither. Only you can determine your gender identity. It's really that internal sense of self. Someone's gender expression is sort of the inverse of that. It's how you publicly present your gender. This can include everything from someone's behavior to their choices about their appearance, like clothing, hair, makeup, nail polish. And a person's chosen name and pronouns are also common ways that folks express gender. If you could go to the next slide. A few more definitions before we move on. A person is transgender if their gender identity is different from the gender that they were thought to be at birth. Someone is cisgender if their gender identity is the same as the gender they were thought to be at birth. And someone who's non-binary is someone who does not identify exclusively as a man or a woman. So just that sense of self doesn't easily fit into sort of a binary understanding of gender. Next slide, please. Can you go one more? I feel like I'm missing a slide here. There's one on sort of why folks choose to play sports. Yep, great. Thank you so much. Okay, so sorry, Brandon, I kind of shuffled the order around these before we started. So why do trans folks want to play sports is sort of kind of a question that I think is implicit in a lot of these conversations. And the answer is really the same reasons that all of you kind of love sports. It's everything from the fact that regular physical activity is really important for physical health. It's associated with decreased risks of 13 different types of cancer. It's also connected to the fact that participating in sports is linked to things like better grades for students and improved mental health outcomes, which is something we'll talk more about later. It's about kind of forming that sense of team or community, making new friends. It's also about competition, right? Like for me personally, I love winning almost as much as I hate losing. But what I really love is just having the privilege to compete, being able to go to a practice or a game and having all of the other stressors in my life sort of fade away. And it's just like such an incredible experience. And lastly, and I think kind of most importantly, because sports are fun, right? I think that's why we all probably started playing sports or getting involved in sports and however we choose to do that. Next slide. Can we go to misconceptions? Fantastic, thank you. So now that I've talked a bit about why trans folks play sports, I want to address sort of some of the common misconception about trans athletes. First being that trans athletes transition for the purpose of gaining an advantage at sports. This just it isn't true. Trans athletes don't transition because of sports. It just doesn't happen. No one would subject themselves to the sort of harassment and discrimination that transgender people face on a day-to-day basis. And that's especially true for transgender athletes who kind of face these negative stereotypes and really frequently have to endure that. The second myth is that when trans girls or women compete, they dominate. They're unbeatable. This is one of those things that's really kind of driven by the fact that the stories you hear about trans athletes tend to be extreme outliers. No one hosts an outrage segment on a cable news program about all the trans folks who are mediocre rec league athletes or intramural athletes. Statistically, trans people make up about 1% of the population. And we've seen way, way, way lower than that in terms of representation of elite athletes from trans folks. And so really only a handful of trans athletes have ever reached any sort of athletic success. And even then, none of them have gotten anything close to a world record or setting some sort of unbeatable mark. The third common misconception is that trans girls or women are bigger, stronger, faster than their teammates and opponents. This is one that we hear all the time, but those who are often kind of crying foul at this idea, or they'll see a 6-foot transgender basketball player. They kind of never mention that a lot of the time she's guarding a cisgender woman who's 6'3". Athletes come in all shapes and sizes, and this is sort of the only situation where we punish and stigmatize athletes for how they were born. The last myth or misconception I just want to briefly touch on is that it's not exclusive if trans athletes are permitted to play even if that team doesn't match their gender identity. Including trans athletes on teams that don't match their gender identities really isn't including them at all. I think some of this is self-evident, right? You can think about how you would feel if you were told to play on a team that didn't match your gender identity. But it also sort of signals to trans athletes that other people get to decide where and when they get to be themselves, which I think is just a message we can all agree is untenable. Next slide, please. Great. So these kind of misconceptions sort of fuel harmful rhetoric that is directly felt by gender nonconforming folks and especially kids, and have resulted in kind of experts saying basically let kids play, especially youth sports where the primary focus of competition isn't on winning any sort of major accolade or elite level of competition. Kids just deserve to be able to play with their friends. Also, it's just worth noting that this is not a new issue. It's just a newly politicized issue. Trans athletes have been participating at all levels of sport for decades. It mostly wasn't really an issue until more recently when it's become something that people tend to campaign on or try to get a bill passed on. Finally, and I think this one is especially huge, research shows that trans-inclusive policies actually increases all girls' participation in sports, while exclusionary policies tend to do the opposite. So there have basically been studies done on states with different policies about transgender inclusion. States that include trans athletes, they see increases in participation from cisgender girls as well as trans girls. And then restrictive policies tend to kind of do the opposite. The exact causal mechanism for that isn't 100% clear at this point, but what we often hear anecdotally from cis women and girls is that they don't want to be subjected to the sorts of gender policing that almost all of these restrictions sort of require. Next slide, please. Right, and so this is also kind of the misconceptions and harmful rhetoric are directly felt by gender and non-conforming folks, and especially kids. 86% of trans boys and 88% of trans girls do not play a sport, right? These are people who have been systemically sort of excluded from sports because they know that they're going to face this harmful rhetoric if they even just try to step on a court or a field. 41% of trans boys and 34% of trans girls report never having felt safe in a locker room, right? That's not they felt unsafe once. That's they never feel safe in a locker room, which is kind of a horrific thing to put kids through. The last thing that I want to touch on is just that 82% of trans youth are not out to their coaches about their gender identity. So this is something that sort of impacts many, many more folks than we know. There are probably athletes that you've interacted with who are grappling with identity issues that you wouldn't necessarily know about, even if you have a good relationship with that athlete. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. On to the last piece, I just want to talk about kind of drive home why this matters. We're talking about an exceptionally vulnerable population here, and inclusive policies can make all of the difference. LGBTQ people, trans people in particular, are at far greater risks of depression, anxiety, and suicide than their straight or cisgender counterparts. But having just one affirming adult can mean everything to someone who's struggling with their identity. As a coach or a staff member or a support, like a support chaperone, you can make that difference in somebody's life, but only if they're allowed to be on the team in the first place. And when we get down to it, just everyone deserves to get to play the game they love with the people they love. Thank you so much. I think it's time for me now to kick things back over to Brandon and Doug. I appreciate you all being here, and I hope you learned something.
Thanks, Chance. And next up, we have Doug Jones presenting on some updates on transgender participation and NWBA policy.
Thank you, Brendan, and especially thank you, Chance. Really interesting and valuable information. So this part of the presentation, our goal is to provide a little bit of a framework for how we have worked in the NWBA through moving the organization into a position to be able to be as focused and as supportive of the broad concept of inclusivity, as we can. It's I think in really every context we have a priority with the NWBA of making the sport inclusive and making it a safe and comfortable place for people to be involved in this sport that they love. So you see a bit of a timeline on this particular slide. Back in 2021, the IOC released their framework on fairness and inclusion and non-discrimination. You can see from the bullets there that the message that was a part of that release was that no athlete should be excluded from competitions on the ground of perceived unfair advantage, while leaving it up. They left it up to the sports federations to decide where that balance lay between inclusion and fairness, and that's really what we're focused on accomplishing in the NWBA, creating this environment to where we can be as inclusive as possible, and we can do it in a manner that perceives fairness all the way around. So the USOPC then supported the development of policies, and each of the NGBs was encouraged to begin working on developing their own policies. And then back in January of this year, earlier, the NCAA announced its supports a sport by support approach to transgender participation. Next slide, please. And then in the fall of 2020, in WBA leadership, even prior to the 2021 edict, the NWBA began talking about the need for this type of a policy. And so in the NWBA's 2021 through 2024 DEI action plan, was submitted to the USOPC for review, and included the objective that you see here on the screen, to promote an inclusive environment through transgender athlete participation within the NWBA and the sport of wheelchair basketball. We did provide a link there if you want to go take a look at the fuller document. And then moving forward from that, in the fall of 2021, the first cohort of NGB trans policy project was launched, and the NWBA was selected among a number of other NGBs to participate. The project timeline was executed in the first and second quarters of this current year. Next slide, please. Once there was discussion and work done on collecting information and looking for some best practices, a policy was presented and discussed by the NWBA Board of Directors at our May 16th, 2022 Board of Directors meeting, and with the goal in that presentation that the policy would be implemented for the 22-23 season, which is upon us now. It was approved, by the Board of Directors via an email vote on May 27th. The vote was by email because it was such a complex discussion that I think the Board of Directors wanted to make sure that we had a really full picture and a comfortable plan. So we collected some additional information between the 16th and the 27th, and then circled back and approved the policy at the link that you see there on the slide. We presented that policy during one of our NWBA town hall meetings in mid-June, and then this educational session, was planned and will be, as Brandon had said, recorded and made available to persons who are not able to attend tonight, or who want to circle back to take a look at the information more closely. Next slide, please. So our guiding principles in the NWBA, and this is, as I mentioned earlier, kind of broadly articulated because the NWBA supports diversity and inclusion in all aspects of wheelchair basketball, not just simply the discussion about transgender athletes. And so the purpose of this new policy is to provide guidance to our own organization, leadership in the organization, and members of the organization on gender eligibility, so that we can make sure that people understand that it's a value for the organization, and how a person who may be transgender can comfortably participate. So the policy was written with the intent of inclusivity in the environment, so that people of all backgrounds could play, and it allows all the athletes to participate on a team that's consistent with their gender identity. And as I think Chance shared, that gender identity is identified by that individual athlete, not by other people for that athlete. So the NWBA's goal is to allow that these athletes all have access to wheelchair basketball in a healthy and respectful environment. Next slide, please. So the policy that was created is new. It's something that we're continuing to pay attention to in terms of being prepared to make adjustments or tweaks to it as we maybe learn additional or better ways to accomplish the goals that we previously articulated. We'll be paying attention to what other NGBs do in terms of best practices and success stories. With this year, we're really pleased to have a starting point that we think is a good starting point, and one that we can consider making changes to or additions or alterations to it as may be needed. So as we begin looking at that, any competition within the NWBA divisions are subject to this policy. You see all 9 of the divisions that are listed on the slide are subject to this policy. The policy, however, is not applicable to any of the individuals who desire to participate or be considered for selection as an athlete in the NWBA High Performance Program. The rules and policies and approaches for that type of opportunity is shaped and governed, you know, by the IWBF and by the US OPC. So, you know, we defer to them for this particular segment of our athletes. Next slide, please. You know, on this slide, that, you know, the point that we're hoping to share is that the vast majority of our programs within the NWBA, regardless of age or competition level, are co-ed play and are already not restricted by gender. So as such, we have NWBA players that are eligible to participate in all of the NWBA divisions, regardless of their gender at birth, their gender identity, any transgender status, and or any gender transition process that they may be involved in. So the NWBA athlete, the way our policy works is an athlete must declare their preference of gender for competition and may provide their gender identity during the individual registration process for an NWBA season. It's new this year that our registration documents have fields for both of those questions to be answered, including the answer of prefer not to share. So this allows us to be more responsive and more aware of athletes who may need the organization's support and who we may want to work closely with in terms of helping ensure that their experience is a positive experience. Next slide, please. So as we start with this year's individual registration, and that has already begun, as I mentioned a moment ago, athletes will provide their gender identity, and in a more thorough and comfortable offering. You know, this is the built into our registration portal. So they will be asked as they complete fields in that portal to identify their preference of gender for NWBA competition. Any NWBA athlete may update their gender identity and gender preference for competition at any time, but in order to do that, we have a change of registration request form. This form is not used exclusively for transgender athletes, but also for other athletes who may be making some change in their registration status. We do that so that we can more clearly track each athlete's status and their team involvement, and so in order to do that, we ask that anyone who is making a change to their gender identity for competition needs to do that 10 days prior to any sanctioned event, so that our organization can have an opportunity to be responsive to that change and to work through that process without it being a last minute type of a situation. On to the next slide, please. So in this slide, our focus, our point is that that all the individuals that are identifying with the preference for competition gender of female will adhere to the current rules for classification points for a female athlete. And you can see those in the divisional guidelines and the rules for information on division-specific rules, which are also available at the link that you see here. There are a number of rules and not just associated with transgender athletes, but each of the divisions may have some differences in terms of classification. For intercollegiate, as an example, eligibility, you know, academic progress, etc. So it's important that people understand that there are some distinctions among the divisions. Next slide, please. So again, this policy was created for the use and intent to allow athletes to participate on the team that's consistent with what they have indicated is their gender identity. And you know, we know that I think, as Chase pointed out, that the overwhelming majority of people who are seeking to participate as a transgender athlete are doing so despite obstacles and roadblocks, and they're not doing it without giving it advanced thought because of the challenges that it creates for them, and the potential for for them to be in an uncomfortable position. We do still, however, have to make sure we have a policy that that positions us for the unlikely event that someone intentionally misuses or abuses our transgender policy. So, in the event that something occurs that surfaces the possibility or probability that is occurring, there, we will have a process where we will review the information associated with that, through the ethics committee to, ensure that we understand the basis for the athletes, if there's a change made in their gender identity status, so that we can protect them and endorse of changes that are appropriately made, while also guarding against the unlikely possibility that somebody chooses to try and use the policy in a way that abuses the policy. Next slide, please. So as you can see on this, the locations on our NWBA website, if you go to the NWBA website and if you click on the About link at the top of the navigation bar, the blue navigation bar, you'll have the opportunity then to drop down and choose diversity and inclusion, and then from there to move to gender eligibility. Next slide, please. So it's important, I think, for folks to know that all of the information we presented today, including the policy, are available on our website. We encourage people to take a look at the policies, to ask questions, not only today, but maybe even more likely on other days by emailing Brandon, so that he can route that question exactly to where it should be sent, so that we get the best possible answer to that question. We are very interested in having feedback, and in addition to the questions, and suggestions also from members of the organization. In terms of how we govern the organization, it is a member-driven organization. So the ideas, the concerns, the high points that all of our members have are pieces that we're very interested in being aware of in leadership of the organization. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah. So we, I hope we've touched on a lot of the information. I hope that that we've been able to be clear in helping folks understand the importance of this for our organization, and the approach that we are taking in order to do our best job possible of managing our eligibility in a way that is inclusive and is fair, and also preserves competitive equity. So if you have questions right now, I think we'll be happy to take those now, and we also would be happy to respond to any questions typed into the chat, or any questions that are emailed at a later point in time. Brandon, back to you.
Yeah, and Doug, I'll just jump in. Is on that website as well. We have a couple of frequently asked questions on there listed out to help if you do want to take a look at there, help hone in on any questions you might have. But as Doug mentioned, feel free to reach out if you want to have a one-on-one conversation or send an email. Feel more comfortable and whatnot. We are available to discuss this and answer any questions that you might have for us. So we do appreciate your time attending and watching. Our next NWBA webinar series will be hosted by Megan Hyman and Lisa Elston on Wednesday, September 14th. And they will be discussing how to start a program or NWBA team from the ground up. So it'll be a really resourceful one for anyone that's trying to start a team in a community, or if you know of a community that's been trying to put together an adaptive sports program of such sort. It doesn't have to be a wheelchair basketball team, even though we want it to be. I definitely think there's going to be a lot of takeaways on how you can start up a adaptive sports program, namely a wheelchair basketball team in your community. So I encourage you all to attend that or share it out to individuals that might be interested. But after that, I just want to say thank you to Doug and Chance again for presenting. Appreciate their time, their due diligence, their expertise, and their knowledge in this. And just want to thank everyone that attended or is watching this later. So thank you so much. And until next time.
Thank you. Have a good night.